Well, happy International Women's Day, everybody. I posted some comments on my Facebook page earlier today, some thoughts around International Women's Day, but I just wanted to expand upon them a little bit for you. Earlier this week, I noticed an exchange between two of my colleagues, Maxime Bernier and a Liberal parliamentary secretary. Maxime was responding to a post that was made by the immigration minister, which listed quite a few expenditures in this year's federal budget that had to do with funding to overcome things like racial disparity and gender disparity. And Maxime's comment was something to the effect of, why do we have all of these silos of funding? Shouldn't we be working towards a colorblind society? And my Liberal colleague had responded with something to the effect of, check your privilege and shut up. And this got me thinking, oftentimes in Parliament, and I've seen this over the last several years, we come to this place where we can't question dogma, or we can't question certain things for lack of, or for risk of being called politically incorrect or worse. And I want to just explore this concept a little bit in terms of feminism and International Women's Day, because I actually think that if we can't sort of have that broader based conversation on how to approach which policy mechanisms we should undertake to achieve a policy end, we're never going to actually come up with progress, right? So it's sort of this hypocritical situation where we see a lot of people on the left say, well, I'm a feminist and that's good enough, or they adhere to one particular school of thought on how to achieve an end goal and then just refuse flat out to discuss the comparative merits of something in a respectful way. And I want to talk about that, about feminism. This last week, I had probably about 15 media requests asking me to explain conservative feminism, like it was somehow impossible or an oxymoron. And I actually think that where my voice and other conservatives in Canada have an important role to play in terms of advancing gender parity is questioning some of the dogma in policy on the left. And I shared some examples with you this morning as part of my written piece on International Women's Day, but I want to give you a few examples where I really feel like if we don't have, these are recent examples, that if we don't have a more constructive debate, we actually don't advance gender parity or other issues, but in the context of today, gender parity. And that's actually damaging, and it pulls the cause back. So the first example that I wanted to raise was the debate around sex work. So many of you followed along in the previous Parliament after the Supreme Court ruled that Canada's existing laws surrounding prostitution were unconstitutional. So Parliament was tasked with coming up with a new set of laws. And what was really interesting to watch was a very powerfully vocal group of sex workers who they put forward into the heart of the debate that sex work was done by choice and it was an empowering thing. And that sort of became one end of the debate, and the other end of the debate became this very moralizing, prostitution is sinful and therefore you're all wrong sort of debate. And it sort of came along this very awkward access rather than actually challenging some of these dogmas. Like, I have a very close friend who works with a rape crisis shelter in the Vancouver area, and she talked about the fact that the reality is a large majority of women do not undertake sex work out of choice. They're pushed there because, they have to feed their family or are in financial destitution. So how do we address that challenge at the same time trying to protect women? Asking about the nature of consent. Is a woman in a consent to sex work if she is doing so to pay her rent or to feed her kids? This is a small example of how I think we kind of lost the narrative on the sex work debate during that period of time. I watched it happen because the focus was so much on, you know, this group of women. And I mean, they have a right to be safe. Absolutely. I'm not dismissing that. But the focus was on this sort of myth, I think, that most women choose to enter that field. And I think that it's valid. And I think conservatives brought that other perspective up and saying, like, well, hold on a second here. That might not be the case. And how do we protect women that are in that situation? I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the Yazidi genocide. I mean, I remember shortly after the last federal election, when it came to light that the United Nations had referred exactly 0 Yazidi survivors of sexual slavery to Canada for resettlement. And the Liberals' response at that point was, well, the United Nations prioritizes the world's most vulnerable, so don't diss the United Nations. And I could pull up committee testimony for you to show you this over and over again, even while Yazidi genocide victims were in the room in committee. This was the government's line. So rather than, sort of question the UN system and saying, okay, well, there is a certain degree of implied privilege on a refugee being able to somehow get to a refugee camp, enter into the system, and then wait in a refugee camp long enough to be able to refer to come to Canada. How does a woman who has escaped sexual slavery, who is part of a religious minority, who is currently undergoing a genocide, how does she fit into this? And shouldn't we be questioning the UN system? And I think that, again, there is another example of, a conservative voice saying we can stand up for women by challenging some of this dogma that the left perpetuates. Another example, gender-based analysis in the review of natural resource projects. Catherine McKenna, the environment minister, came out because some people were asking her, like, well, what does this mean? What does a gender-based analysis for an oil pipeline mean? And she used the example of, well, there are women who might be affected by a large degree of men coming into a work camp. And so what I think she was alluding to was the fact that there could be sexual assault by men who work on oil sands camps. And she used that example singularly several times. But what she failed to look at in that situation was that I've seen articles in my local newspaper about women having to turn to sex work in Calgary because they've been out of work, or their husbands have been out of work, their partners have been out of work. She didn't talk about the fact that her regulatory changes that have basically gutted the energy sector in this country have laid off a lot of women, have disproportionately put an emotional burden on women who have had to support spouses that have been out of work. I mean, where was that? And so I think that, again, a conservative feminist voice in that perspective said, you can't use your liberal dogma singularly under the guise of feminism to justify political ideology in another area. And I think that that's very important, too, because you can't just paint all women with one brush. Another example, Oxfam, I came to you on a video a few weeks ago, there's allegations of this organization having some of its officials being involved in sexual exploitation of women. Yet we're sending millions and millions of dollars to this organization to undertake aid work for us on empowering women. Shouldn't we pause funding and ask them to tell us how they're fixing this problem? But the Liberal government has said no. There's another example of a conservative voice on what I think is a very feminist issue, questioning dogma. I guess the point that I'll close with one other example, and this is even more dogmatic, and it kind of goes across political lines, and that is, how do we question theocratic laws that oppress women? There are many countries around the world that employ theocratic law that is used to subjugate women. I mean, the example of that woman in Iran who took her head covering off, being imprisoned for 24 months. We should be vocally criticizing that. We shouldn't be giving, we shouldn't be quiet on our condemnation of that sort of stuff. And then at home, across different religions, we shouldn't shy away from criticizing when dogma, religious theocratic dogma, enters into secular law or mores. And it happens frequently. And what I find is that if we don't go into that space, we're actually doing a disservice towards addressing some of the, undercurrents and societal pressures on some of the causalities for gender inequality. So I guess I could go on, but I won't make a 45-minute Facebook video here. The point that I'm trying to impart is that if we don't have different voices on the issue of how we come up with policy solutions to address gender parity, we actually will never have gender parity, because the propensity is, especially on the left, is to stick rigidly to one policy solution that might not be nimble enough to address some of these issues in the future. Now, that's not to give us a free pass as conservatives on looking inwardly and asking, okay, well, what do we believe in terms of gender parity? For me, I am a conservative because I believe in the equality of opportunity of all individuals, regardless of gender, sexual orientation, religion, any other demographic. I believe that we should be looking at systemic barriers that prevent entry into the economy for any person, and that we should be looking at true equality. And I think that's what Max is trying to get at with his comment earlier this week. And I think it's important for us to have this debate because it influences government policy, spending, our foreign policy, all of these things. So, I guess what I want to challenge you on International Women's Day and challenge some of your friends is that this is a topic worthy of discussing, but it's one that we need to question dogma on all the time. And so, yeah, I'm a conservative, and I believe that we can have equality of opportunity for all individuals. And to me, that's what conservative feminism is. Working hard for you on International Women's Day in Calgary. Have a great day.